No, he's not the Slender Man. He's the Tall Man. Yes, I know he's a tall man who is slender, but he's not the Slender Man. He's the Tall Man. Yes, I know Slender Man is also tall. I mean, we go through this every time. Hey, what's going on, everyone? My name is Keith, and this is VHS on Tape, where I do movie reviews for horror movies that came out in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. If this is your first time here, welcome to the channel. If you like this kind of stuff, please consider subscribing. Today we're going to take a look at a cult classic, Phantasm. Now, if you've never seen this movie, then you're in for quite a treat. I remember after the first time watching this thinking, what the hell did I just watch? But this movie is kind of like company slogans. You know, like you might not like them at first, but then they kind of grow on you. Phantasm came out March 28th, 1979, and comes in at 1 hour and 29 minutes. This was another low-budget horror movie, with the budget being right around 300 grand. The tagline for it was, "If this one doesn't scare you, you're already dead." I mean, that's a pretty great tagline, right? It was written and directed by Don Coscarelli. You might recognize his name from some of his more famous films, such as Kenny and Company and Jim, the World's Greatest, or possibly from some of his lesser known, more obscure works like Beastmaster and Bubba Hotep. Probably never heard of him. Now, I'm sure when he wrote this, he had no idea just how much of a cult classic it would become. Just like I'm sure he didn't realize by making this movie, he would release upon the world one of the biggest sex symbols of the late 70s. Reggie Bannister. Now, I'm pretty sure that Reggie in that vest was at least 50% of the reason why this movie was originally hit with an X rating. And this bowler hat alone, that accounted for the other 50%. By the way, that's Bill Thornbury. He played the big brother Jody. Then we have Michael Baldwin playing the younger brother Mike. And I have to admit that for the longest time, I thought that Mike was actually played by Eric Stoltz. I mean, I don't know. Am I the only one who sees it? I mean, I guess that's what happens when you don't read the credits. Kathy Lester is the lady in lavender. Then we have Angus Scrimm as the movie's villain, the Tall Man, who in reality was only 6'4", which was only 4 inches taller than Jody. So to make him appear taller, they had him put lifts in his shoes. Phantasm is the story of 13-year-old Mike and his older brother Jody, whose parents died before the film actually starts, and now Jody is taking care of Mike. The movie starts off with one of Jody's friends, Tommy, being stabbed to death in a graveyard in number 24 on Maxim's 50 hottest sex scenes of all time list.
Oh, that was great, baby.
Here we find out that the tall man can apparently transform into a lady. This, by the way, never gets an explanation. You just kind of have to roll with it. But that's only the beginning. Now, after quietly sneaking around to watch Tommy's funeral, Mike ends up seeing some rather peculiar things. To achieve this scene, they made the coffin out of balsa wood and put a rope handle on the one side. That way it would make the tall man look like he was freakishly strong. It worked. And he decides he needs to investigate further. But first, he talks to a psychic. Because that's just what you do when you're 13. Mike then breaks into the mortuary and discovers that there are in fact some unusual things happening there. Mike finally gets Jody to believe him about what he saw at the mortuary.
Okay, I believe you.
And with a little help from Jody's friend Reggie, you remember Reggie, they discover the tall man's nefarious plot to turn people into dwarves and make them slaves. Yeah, I will say it's kind of hard to talk about this movie because there's just so much stuff going on in it. As you can tell by the characters' names, they did not put a lot of thought into them. I mean, Reggie plays Reggie, Mike plays Mike, the bad guy's name is just simply the tall man. Okay, so Coscarelli phoned in the character names, right? I mean, that must mean that he put all of his effort into the script, right? Well, that's actually kind of a hard question to answer. You see, the original cut of this movie was actually over 3 hours long. It had a lot of character development, and you didn't even meet the tall man until 1.5 hours into it. Coscarelli realized that that was just way too long for this movie, so he cut it down to just 90 minutes. And in the process, he cut a lot of the scenes that connected other scenes together and made the movie more coherent. This film is often described as dreamlike, and there's a couple of reasons for that. One is, well, the cuts. They really did make this movie feel really disjointed. Another is the fact that the idea for this movie actually came to Coscarelli in a dream. So that's kind of what he was actually going for, anyways. And it turns out that's what the fans really love about it. It is a very unique kind of horror movie. And speaking of fans, the fans of this franchise, that's right, they've made five so far, are pretty die-hard fans. They tend to consider the tall man as an overlooked horror movie bad guy, that should be up in the ranks with Michael Myers or Jason. Now, while I don't quite agree with that, I do think he's an interesting character, and I do like this movie, and a big part of it is because of how oddly it plays out. That opening scene in the graveyard really does help set the expectations of the movie. We go from a woman transforming into an old dude to Mike breaking into the mortuary and discovering, well, this guy. Then we get introduced to the flying spheres. By the way, there is also no explanation for these, they're just there. During this sequence is when we get the scene that originally landed this movie with an X rating. The big reason was because the dude pees himself after he dies, and then they show it on the floor. I guess the censors didn't like that, but LA Times film critic Charles Champlin did. So apparently, he called in a favor to a friend that was on the MPAA board and got it downgraded to an R rating. I mean, this guy probably single handedly saved this movie because an X rating was pretty much a film's death sentence. Pretty good dude. Pretty good dude. Then we get the finger scene from earlier where we find out that there is something pretty off with the tall man. Then immediately after that, we are introduced to the dwarves. Now, all of this happens in less than 3 minutes, so it is a lot coming at you. And you'll probably hear people say that the dwarves look an awful lot like the Jawas from Star Wars, and that this movie copied it from that movie, but the design for the dwarves was actually completed before that Star Wars movie even came out. So it's just a coincidence. Next, Mike convinces Jody about what he saw at the mortuary by showing him one of the tall man's severed fingers, which promptly turns into this. And again, no explanation of how a finger turned into this or why all of the tall man's fingers aren't like this. That's just a recurring theme for this movie. Just go with it. Then the brothers discover that the dwarves are actually dead people that the tall man shrunk down. And here's where it gets weird. He's shrinking them down to use as slaves on his home planet. He has to shrink them down because the gravity on his planet apparently would be too much for unshrunk people. We actually get a glimpse of what his planet looks like, too. Oh, yeah, and we're still not done yet. Reggie accidentally activates the portal by just being too damn sexy, and then the mortuary starts to get sucked into the other world. Minutes later, Reggie gets killed by the tall man, who at this point has transformed back into the lady in lavender, and then, finally, Mike and Jody go on to get rid of the tall man. Now, here's where they mess with your head. After defeating the tall man, Mike wakes up in bed, and Reggie tells him it was just a dream, that Jody died in a car accident and that the tall man doesn't exist. So Jody, who didn't die, is dead, and Reggie, who did die, is alive? Okay. So the whole movie was just made up in Mike's mind to cope with Jody's death? Okay, I mean, alright, I guess I can get on board with that, but that's the end, right? You. So let me get this straight. It was all in Mike's head, and the tall man isn't real, except for the fact that he is real. Okay, cool. Cool. Overall, this is a good movie for what it is. I mean, the writing doesn't come across as being good, but without seeing what the full cut looks like, it's kind of hard to say if it was any better before the cuts. The acting is about what you'd expect for a movie with this kind of plot. And it does have some good special effects, especially for the time it was made. I've said it before and I'll say it again. It's these kinds of special effects that really help make these kinds of movies entertaining. Now, I did want to talk about the music for a second. I actually really like this theme song. I think it really fits the movie, and overall, the music that they played throughout the movie is actually pretty good. And, I have on vinyl the soundtrack. Sorry, I just gotta find it here. It was actually signed by Angus Scrimm, so it's pretty cool. And it was right here, but hey, did one of you happen to move my record?
Sure wasn't that retarded kid Timmy up the street?
I'll go ask him. And now, time for some fun facts. The dwarves in this movie were actually played by children. I personally don't think that the spheres are that scary. I mean, at least I wouldn't be scared of them if I was in the movie. I take back my previous fun fact. Some of the cut footage was used as the framework for Phantasm 4 some 19 years later. Because of the low budget, Coscarelli would rent the filming equipment from a company that was not open on the weekends. So he would rent it on a Friday, they could use it all weekend, return it on a Monday, and only end up paying 1 day rental fee. It's pretty smart. To get the sphere's footage, they would have a baseball pitcher throw the sphere from behind the camera, or attach it to the guy's head and then pull it away. Then they would print the shot in reverse. So, would I recommend watching Phantasm?
You're damn right.
It's definitely a movie that you have to watch the whole thing to truly appreciate it. Plus, you'll have to watch it if you want to find out what's going on here. Go on. I know you're curious. Alright, what do you guys think? Have you seen Phantasm? Did you like it? Let me know in the comments. In my last video, I reviewed the original Halloween, so I'll link it somewhere, either on the screen or in the comments, just in case you want to check that out. Well, that's going to do it for this one. Thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.